Hi, I'm Gary Katz. I want to thank all the folks who bought copies of my DVD programs over the last 20 years. If it wasn't for their support and the support of companies like Windsor One and Stabila, I never would have been able to produce what turned out to be a 10-program series on mastering Finish carpentry. Those 12 to 20-year-old videos look pretty terrible compared to streaming video today. And that's why I'm no longer selling the DVDs. But the carpentry techniques haven't aged much at all. And that's why I'm making them available here for free. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Gary Katz, and welcome to the On-Site Educational Home Building Series. If you're a return viewer, welcome back. I'm going to be installing casing and baseboard in this program, from picture frame windows, like this one, to stool and apron, like you see on this window, and from classical overdoor entablatures, like I have on this door here, to really wide casing, like you see on this door, which means there's a lot of ground to cover. But before we touch a tool, I want to say something about the craft. Whether you're framing or finishing a home, carpentry shouldn't be a fight. You can't do good work if you're struggling with the workpiece or the tools. Patience and enjoyment are key ingredients for successful finish work. You'll do better work if you're enjoying yourself. And if you do better work, you'll make more money, among other things. I've picked up a lot of smart techniques from other carpenters. I've even figured out a few on my own. I'll be pointing out those techniques throughout this program, and I'm sure they'll help you enjoy your work more. And they'll also help you work accident-free. Remember, smart carpentry is also safe carpentry. Now let's case this picture frame window. When I teach new apprentices how to install casing, I always have them use a reveal block. This is just a square of wood that I rabbited 1/4 inch on all 4 sides and glued this little homemade knob on. Some carpenters cut 2 different reveals in their blocks, 3/16 on 2 sides and 1/4 inch on the other 2 sides. But I use the same reveal on all 4 sides. That way, no matter which way I put the block in the window, I can't make a mistake. For most windows and doors, I just mark the tops of the jambs. If the window's picture frame, though, like this one will be, I mark the jamb at the sill, too. Most of my reveals end up being about 3/16 of an inch because I crowd the lines when I install the molding, so the pencil marks won't show even in stain grade work. And if I'm installing casing on ganged windows, where the windows and doors are right beside each other, I'll take the reveal block and hold the pencil against it and just drag the whole thing right down the jamb and mark a continuous line all the way down the jamb. That's how I recommend most apprentices get started, at least until they develop a good eye. But when it comes to installing casing, one of the biggest problems isn't the joinery, but the condition between the jamb and the wall. If the finished wall, the drywall in this case, isn't flush with the jamb, then the miters won't fit tightly. Let me show you what I mean. If the drywall is proud of the jamb, it'll force the miter apart just like this. The short point will open up. Conversely, if the jamb's proud of the drywall, it'll force the molding like this. I'm exaggerating a lot just so you can see this, and this large molding really helps to see it too. So it's really important to get the drywall flush to the jamb. That's why when I start a new job, one of the first things I do is have one of my apprentices walk through the house with a scrap of casing about this size. And wherever the drywall is proud of the jamb, I have him trace a pencil line on the outside of the drywall with the piece of casing flush to the jamb. That way, when he traces his line back here, and he takes his hammer and beats that drywall down so that it's flush to the jamb, the casing, when it goes on, shifts back 1/4 inch for the reveal, and it'll cover that line and all the hammer marks too. Of course, if the drywall starts to project more than 1/4 inch, you got to install jamb extensions. For more on that, see the slideshow that accompanies this program. Now let's get back to that little window. If you recall from Mastering the Miter Saw Part 1, I talked a lot about short points and long points. Well, when you work with casing, you only have to worry about short points. That's because casing surrounds an opening like a picture frame. All your measurements are taken from the short point to the short point of the material. If you're installing casing on all four sides of a window, all you have to do is measure from reveal line to reveal line. I write those measurements down on a cut list before walking to the saw. I always carry a pad of paper like this in my bags, and I hand them out frequently to the carpenters on our crew. Otherwise, you waste too much time returning to measure things. When you cut casing on a miter saw, be sure the short point where the measurements are marked is away from the fence, so you can guide the saw blade right to the mark. And always keep your hand at the back of the saw fence so you can control the material and creep it incrementally right up to the blade. If you use that creep method, you'll be able to cut precisely every time, all the time. This is the last piece I needed, so now let's go back to that window and put it on. After cutting the molding, always start installing at the top, but just tack it in place until all the pieces are attached to the jamb. I use an 18 gauge brad gun to fashion the casing to the jamb. Then later, I secure it with a 15 gauge or a 16 gauge gun. I'll get into nail guns a little more in a few minutes. Next, I check that the miters will fit tightly. Occasionally, they need a little help. This one here is just open a tiny bit right here at the short point. That could be because the back of the miter is touching first, or the jamb's a little proud of the wall. Rather than planing down the jamb, I carry a little sanding block to take just a little off the back of the miter. You can also use a low-angle plane like this one, but you have to keep it razor sharp. Finally, once I get the miters to fit nice and tight, I glue them up. Always glue your miters. If the material's wood, you can shoot a nail right through the miter like that to lock it together, but be sure to do that before nailing the molding to the wall. If the material's MDF though, don't nail through the miter or you'll split the casing right up the back. Use a shim instead. You can cut them out of MDF. They break off real easily. You can put one through the top if the top casing needs to come out a little from the wall, or you can put one right through the side if it's the side that needs to come out from the wall. You can fuss more with that while nailing the casing to the wall. Right now, I'll install this other leg. Yeah, that fits pretty good. You know, before I put any more nails in this thing, I want to get down to the bottom and make sure I line up those miters too. Start by tacking the sill piece to the jamb about a foot back from the miter. If it's a long window, use 2 brads. Then check that the miters fit perfectly, both sides. Remember, if the legs are a little long and you have to fudge the sill down a little, don't just push on it. You might split the casing right on the brad. Instead, remove the nails and start over. Yes, you should always carry a small pry bar, like this one, or a bigger one like this, so you can remove material carefully. Don't be tempted to use the claws on your hammer. The claws on your hammer are meant for demolition work, not finish work. For lateral adjustment, you can tap one end or the other just a little if you're also pushing on the casing at the same time with your hand, and you won't damage the miter. Once you know the miters will fit perfectly, finish tacking the pieces to the jamb. That little pry bar comes in handy right there. Once you know the miters will fit perfectly, finish tacking the pieces to the jamb first. Then nail the casing to the wall. And with MDF casing, that's when you need to use those small shims to flush the miters up. With paint grade trim, you can caulk the outside of the casing to the wall right over the shims. With stain grade material, sometimes the walls will have to be floated just a little. When I case doors, I start at the top too. If I'm installing casing before the finished floor is installed, then I cut all the legs exactly the same length, just short of the floor, rather than use a cut list. But if the finished flooring's been installed, hardwood or stone, then I cut the legs a little long and fit them right at the door. I turn the casing upside down, with the miter just touching the floor. And then I scribe a line across the top of the head casing. I always take the line so the miter will fit tight just as the casing touches the floor. That about covers simple casing, like this little 2.5-inch molding. Now let's get into the fun stuff. Big casing, built-up casing, and stool and apron, like this window. I don't know about you, but I've learned carpentry mostly the hard way by making a lot of mistakes. For instance, take a look at this photograph. If this window were cased properly, the back of the casing would be plumb with the end of the apron. Notice how it isn't? I trimmed the window for this photograph before I knew any better. Now look at this window. Notice how the apron and the casing are perfectly plumb. That's the way it's supposed to be. When I first started working with historic moldings, I didn't realize they were different than standard beveled stool. That looks just like this, with a 5-degree bevel on the face. You can self-return it just on your miter saw by cutting another 5-degree bevel on the end. It's easy to determine the length of this stool. Just double the width of the casing and the reveals on the jamb, then add about 3/4 of an inch. So you have enough reveal at the back of the casing, between the back of the casing and the stool. No problem. Your casing and your apron will line up without any difficulty. But here, that just didn't work. Actually, I'm kind of glad it didn't. It's good that molding styles have changed, that we're no longer installing simple little profiles in nicer homes. But now that we're installing better molding, we've got to change our work habits too. On this window, the stool has a 3/4 inch bullnose, and a 3/4 inch cove molding sits on top of the apron. All those measurements must be considered when determining the length of the stool. Making a mock-up is often the best way for a carpenter to get his hands around a design like this. Here you can see that in addition to the casing, you have to add another 3/4 of an inch for the bullnose, 3/4 of an inch for the cove molding, and at least 1/4 of an inch for the reveal between the bullnose and the cove molding. For this style of stool and apron, I had 12.5 inches to the width of the jamb. That's because the casing measures 4.5 inches on each side of the window, and that includes the reveal on the jamb. So for this little window, I'll add 12.5 inches to the inside dimension of the jamb. That's 24 inches plus 12.5, which equals 36.5 inches. I'll write that number down on my cut list. Hey, now I'm ready to cut the stool to length, right? Wrong. First, I need to figure out how far I want the stool to project into the room. Like most rabbeted window stool, this profile comes wider than necessary. If you don't rip it down, the reveal on the front won't match the reveal on the sides unless you make the ears really long. And if you do that, then the stool will stick out from the wall like Cyrano's nose. The sash on this window measures 1.5 inches from the wall. I'm going to get into that a little more in a minute. The apron, cove molding, and the bullnose, plus the reveal here, measures 2.25 inches. So that means the stool has to be 3 3/4 inches wide, 2.25 for the stool and the apron, and 1.5 inches for the distance between the window and the wall. I'll cut this stool to 4 inches just to be safe. Hey, if I've confused you with all the math and the reveals, take a look at the article on stool and apron that's included with this DVD. Notice I used a push stick. It's not because Bosch supports this program and I'm supposed to demonstrate safe techniques. I use a push stick because it lengthens my hand about 10 inches, which gives me more control over the workpiece. That way, I can push the material through the blade and hold it against the fence at the same time. That's the only way to get a smooth, clean cut. Yeah, and a push stick will save my fingers too. Oh, I just cut that rabbit off, didn't I? No big deal. Now I'm going to cut another rabbit. That's one of the reasons I have the saw guard removed. You can't cut a rabbit with a standard saw guard in place, nor can you make thin rips with the blade right close to the fence. First, I'm going to set this fence 1/2 inch from the blade. And then I'm going to raise the blade so it's 1.5 inches above the table. Remember, the sash on that window was 1.5 inches from the wall. I'll explain more about that in a minute. Notice how I use that push stick again? I'm so accustomed to depending on a push stick that I can't use a saw without one, which is kind of nice, especially when I'm making a deep rabbet like that. With a push stick this size and shape, there's much less chance of something going wrong. And if it does, my hand will sail right past the blade. But with a push stick like this, my hand will be pushing right toward the blade. definitely the wrong direction if something slips. Now I'll drop the blade so it's a 1/2 inch above the table, and I'll move the fence so it's 1.5 inches from the far side of the blade. It's 1.5 inches from the far side of the blade because that's the depth of the rabbet. I like to use a steel square for making fine measurements at the table saw rather than a flexible tape measure. The steel square is rigid and it's easier to hold securely against the table or the fence, which means I can measure more precisely. You probably noticed that I use my left hand too, but I wasn't pressing hard on the stock, just applying a little bit of pressure. Operating a table saw safely and effectively depends on where you apply pressure on the workpiece, not how much pressure you apply. If you apply too much pressure here at the front of the fence, the material will wiggle as it enters the blade and might bind. Even if it doesn't bind, you won't get a straight rip. The same can happen if you apply too much pressure here at the back of the fence, which often happens when you're cutting wide stock like plywood. That's when the blade can really bind and might even throw the material right at you. The object is to keep the material against the fence throughout the entire cut, so I always apply pressure in this direction, diagonally across the material, toward the far end of the fence and just beyond the blade. By pressing diagonally on the material, I simultaneously move the wood through the blade and firmly against the fence. Believe me, if cutting material on your table saw is hard work, or even marginally stressful, then you're either doing something wrong, your blade is dull, or you're using the wrong blade. For more about blades, see the article on this DVD. Remember, finished carpentry has to be fun. It's about finesse, not physique. Now I'm ready to cut the stool to length. Because of the bullnose here, I've got to cut a self-return on both ends. So I start with the right side. I always tend to move material from my left to my right. Maybe because I'm right-handed. You know, some people are under the mistaken impression that I'm a king when it comes to carpentry. Baloney. I've learned most things the hard way. In fact, it wasn't until I started doing national shows and meeting carpenters across the country that I began to learn things the easy way from other carpenters who'd already learned them the hard way. Darrell Day, a finished carpenter from Florida, convinced me that the only way to cut self-returns is to cut the cap off first. I just made a square cut there first. Now I'm going to cut the self-return cap off. Always cut the cap first. The little piece that turns the corner to the wall, that way you can cut the miter right next to it and the grain will wrap perfectly around the corner. And if you're working with material that's not milled as consistently as this molding, then you won't have to worry about mismatched profiles. Once I cut the cap off, I'll save this little piece, I swing the saw and I cut a miter on this end. Now I hook my tape measure on the long point of that miter and pull that measurement to 36.5 inches. And swing my saw, and I could cut this miter right now. Oh, you know what? I had my pencil out. I should have told you. I use a 2.5 lead pencil, not a number 2, and definitely not a framer's crayon. Remember, finished carpentry is all about precision and accuracy. You can't be accurate or precise unless you can measure, mark, and cut that way. You know, Since this piece is so short, I think I'll cut the cap first, right off this end here, and then I'll cut the miter. Otherwise, I'd have this little short piece I'd have to work with, and that's just too dangerous. I'll cut this off square first. And then I'll swing my saw in this direction. Now remember, I've got my hand back here behind the fence, so I can do that creeping movement. And I'll cut this off right at the back of the stool. And there's the piece. That's the second cap. I always try to avoid cutting short pieces like that, because that's when you have to use the death grip to hold the piece still. And anytime you use the death grip, you're putting your fingers and your hands at risk. Because if you use your hand as a clamp and something happens, you know, if the saw binds or hits a knot, you won't be able to let go, and your hand might be pulled right into the blade. As I showed you earlier, I always keep my hands at the far side of the fence so I can control the material and creep the measurement mark right up to the blade. And that's the only way to cut precisely. Well, now let's put those pieces together. Until a year ago, when I learned about 2P10 glue, I always glued these miters on the self-returns with Tite Bond 2. And I put some spring clamps on the miter. These are spring clamps. I'll show you a little bit more how to use these when I do that overdoor trim there. But they're miter clamps, and you just hook them onto the miter like so. And that way, you can take a brad nail and shoot it right through the miter and lock the miter together. But I'm going to cut right through these miters to make the horns of the ears on the stool, you know, so it's nice not to have a nail in the way. So I won't use this. Instead, I'll use the 2P10 glue. It's fast acting, and I don't even need spring clamps. If you put the gel onto the small piece, just put a thin line across the top. You don't need a lot. And then put another one right across the bottom. That's plenty. And then spray the activator onto the longer piece. And that way, you can hold your hand back from the miter, and you won't get activator all over your hand. Then to assemble it, this stuff dries really fast once the activator touches the gel. So keep it separated and put your thumb or your finger right on the long point of the miter and hinge that joint closed. And put a lot of pressure on it and squeeze it together real hard. You can run your finger across the top just to be sure it's flush, and hold it still for just a second. And move it around a little bit on the table just in case some of the squeeze out comes out. It could get stuck to the table. And move your fingers around too. Otherwise they'll get stuck right to the wood. Then there's going to be a little squeeze out left on the top or the bottom. Spray it with a little bit of activator. It'll dry immediately. And as soon as it dries, you can take a sharp chisel and just peel it off, because it'll come off in one piece of plastic. I'm going to glue up this other miter too. So I'll do the same thing over again. Put the gel on the small piece. A couple little lines. And then get your ducks in a line here so you're all set to put this together. Spray the activator just a little, it doesn't take a lot, on the miter. And then hinge that closed. Give it a squeeze, and then touch it just to make sure that it's flush. And then squeeze it up tight. Hold it for a second, and then move that piece around because it'll start to stick to the tabletop. And you saw how my fingers stuck there a little. Move your fingers around too. There. Now I'm ready to scribe this at the opening. Here's what a finished piece of stool looks like. It's been cut for the horns or ears on each end, and it fits inside of the jamb, just like so. And when it fits right, the back of the stool should kiss up tight against the sash. At the same time, the ears of the horns come up tight and snug against the wall. When I first started out in this business, I always measured for these ears or horns with a tape measure, and the stool rarely kissed up against the sash perfectly, at least not the first time. So now, I scribe every piece of stool, and here's another good reason why. This piece of sash measures about, 1 3/16 inches from the face of the frame on this side, and on this side, it measures about 1 5/16 inches, so it's not parallel to the wall. That's the kind of situation you run into, just like that, on most remodels. In that case, if you measured for those horns, you'd never get the back of the stool to come up tight against the sash. You need to have the stool parallel to the sash and then scribe it to fit in order for the ears to come up tight against the wall at the same time that the stool comes up tight against the sash. Let me show you how I set up for that scribe. First, I take a couple of blocks and I nail them right to the wall. I'm going to pull these off later so the nail holes won't show. The blocks will make it easier for me to scribe this piece without getting tense, without having to worry about using my hands or my leg as a clamp. The first thing I want to do, though, is I want to find the center of the stool. It's 18 1/4 because this piece is 36 1/2. I'm going to double check that just to be sure. I'm not that great when it comes to math. Yep, it's 18 1/4 right to the center. I've already marked a center mark on the jamb here, so I'll just slide this over until it's perfectly centered. Now, I'm going to use this shim here and this clamp to help me scribe this. First, remember it measured about 1 1/4 inches, 1 5/16 inches on this side, so I want to get this side to measure the same. I'm going to put this shim in here, and I'm going to slide this out until I got the same measurement on this side, about 1 5/16 inches. So that's exactly where I want it. So I'll take this clamp and just set it in this window here and gently clamp that piece. I don't want to squeeze on it too hard, but now I want to check and make sure that this thing is perfectly parallel. Yeah, it's 1 5/16 inches at that end, and at this end, it's the same. One more way I want to check this is with my scribes. I'm going to spread my scribes now so that they'll just reach from the sash to the back of the stool. There, the pencil is right on the edge of the stool. Then I'll move them over here and check this end too. That'll be just fine. So now that I know that the stool is parallel to the sash, I can scribe both of the horns. I'll just take my scribes and I'm holding them perpendicular to the wall. In other words, I'm making sure that my scribes stay square to the wall like this. Let me put this over here, you can see better. I'm making sure that my scribes stay square to the wall, just like so. That way, while I'm scribing the horns, my scribe line will be parallel to the wall. If I were to take my scribes and lay them down like this while I was scribing, then I wouldn't be scribing a line that's parallel to the wall. I'm going to also use my square to scribe these shoulders. There we go. Now remember, whenever you scribe against a square like this and your square is against another surface, you know that this pencil line, and you can almost even see it, is a little bit too far in this direction. If I were to cut to that pencil line, this piece of stool would barely fit in this opening. Matter of fact, it'd be too tight. I'd have to force it. So when I make this shoulder cut right here, I'm going to make sure that I take the graphite, all of it, with the jigsaw blade, and that's what I'm going to cut this line with. And then this piece will have a better chance of fitting in on the first try. Now, let's go back to the table saw and cut these scribe lines. Like a lot of professional carpenters, sometimes I use a table saw in, well, let's just say unusual ways. If you don't use a table saw every day, or if this method makes you uncomfortable, then don't do it. This cut can also be made with a jigsaw, and I'm going to show you how to do that in just a minute. But many carpenters in the field use table saws freehand, and some of them use them without the fence. That's way too risky for me. When you do that, and you push the material into the blade, it's too easy to wiggle it around and bind the material in the blade, and that's when serious kickback can really hurt you. So I start by lining up the fence so that the blade is cutting just wide of the pencil line. I'm going to line it up so the pencil line is right in the center of the blade. Once the blade gets going, I'm going to use this fence back in here as a fulcrum, and I'm going to pivot the material right off the fence and guide it into the blade so that the blade cuts just on this side of the pencil line. You know, if the fence wasn't here, I'd have a tough time following that line. There'd be nothing to help me guide the piece into the blade. But with the fence acting as a fulcrum, it's pretty easy to keep the blade right on the scribe line. You can see I stopped the cut right at the shoulder and lifted the piece up out of the saw. That makes a really nice and easy way to finish this cut with a jigsaw later, and you'll see that too. But right now, I'm going to move this fence and make the second cut. Once again, I'm going to line it up so that the blade is cutting just wide of the mark, just a little bit. I'm going to make the rest of this cut with a jigsaw. You can see the saw blade was starting to come outside my scribe line right there. And I don't want to do that, especially in this area here, because that's where the reveal on the jamb is. This area all through here is going to be covered by the casing, so it doesn't matter if I get off the scribe line. But right up in here, I've got to be right on the scribe line, or you'll see it, because the casing won't cover it. And this line here I'm going to cut with a jigsaw too, so I'll just get them both with the jigsaw. Let's do that right now, actually. Always clamp your work to a table or something, whether you're using a power tool or a hand tool. You can't concentrate on doing fine finish work if you're struggling with two jobs at one time. And if you're using your hand as a clamp, you can't make a perfectly clean cut, which means you'll be working twice as hard for half the success. So I always carry an A-clamp in my bags, and I hang quick grip clamps for my miter saw and my table saw. You know, if you keep them handy, you'll use them more often. I'm going to clamp this piece down here. And clean these cuts up with a jigsaw. Now I'm going to come in on this shoulder cut. You notice I'm taking the line with the jigsaw, and I mean just taking the line. I'm able to control the cut because I have both hands on the tool. My left thumb is acting as a guide against the saw's base, which helps keep the cut perfectly straight, and it also keeps my thumb from getting cut off because it stays right there. And because I used a table saw to make this long cut, the waste falls right away as soon as I reach the corner. But sometimes the scribe line right along the wall or the jamb requires a little extra trimming, especially if the jamb's proud of the wall. There's only two places where the stool has to be perfectly tight. Right here, where the casing steps back and leaves a little reveal on the jamb, and right here at the back of the casing, where the horn provides a termination point for the apron below. This area must be tight against the wall, especially on stain grade work. In those two areas, be sure to cut right to the scribe line. There. Now let's go see how this fits. There, that fits pretty good. The ears are tight against the walls and the jamb, and the stool is also tight against the sash, at least tight enough for this job site. You know, sometimes the shoulder cuts right in here are a little long. For small fixes like that, I carry a file in my toolbox, in my bags usually too, and you can just file these edges down a little bit if it's too tight. Oh, you know, about 2 weeks after we shot that last video sequence, I stopped using this old file. I always hated it because the serrations don't go all the way to the edge, so you can't clean up an inside corner. And besides, this file is so narrow that I can't hold it in files to a straight line. Now, I use this Shinto rasp. This tool cuts into sharp corners. It's easy to control right to a scribe line, and it removes material lickety-split. Sometimes a scribe isn't just perfect the first time. If the stool's a little too tight against the sash and it hits the sash just before it hits the wall, then take a little bit off the back of the stool. I carry my block plane with me everywhere I go. It's razor sharp, so it makes it real easy to take a couple of quick passes off of there. There, now it fits even better. Now I'll cut the apron in the cove mold. The apron lines up with the outside of the casing. With both reveals, that measures an additional 9 inches over the inside of the jamb. So I'll make the apron 33 inches long from self-return to self-return. Yeah, I cut self-returns on both ends of the apron too, so the end grain won't pop through the paint. As with any self-return, first I cut the cap. I let the blade stop before moving the saw, so the piece won't be drawn into the teeth and ruined. And then I cut the miter. It's easy to hook my tape measure on the long point and make the measurement mark, just like I did with the other pieces. I need one more self-return cap for this end, and since this piece is pretty short, I'll cut that right now, and then I'll swing the saw and cut the miter. Now I'll cut the cove molding. The cove molding is so small that the self-return caps are often drawn right into the blade, and when that happens, they're ruined. Plus, they might shoot out and hit the cameraman. So I'm going to use this zero clearance fixture. Before I made this fixture, I used to put a stick of wood behind the cove molding to stop the cutoff from flying into the blade. But several carpenters on the JLC Finish Carpentry Forum gave me a much better idea. I borrowed their ideas and I added a few twists of my own to make this fixture. And for details on how to build it, see the slideshow. First I cut the self-return cap. Because the cove molding wraps around the apron, I cut the cap 3/4 of an inch long from the short point. And if you're doing a lot of these windows, make a mark like this, like I've done here, 3/4 of an inch right from the end of the fixture, so you don't have to pull out a tape measure. And this is an outside corner, so the short point should be against the fence. notice, each time I change the direction of the miter, I slide the fixture too. It's easy to line the fixture up with the blade. I just flush it up on this end for a left-hand miter, and I flush it up on this end for a right-hand miter. For a 90-degree cut, I made 2 saw curves right in the top, and all I have to do is flush one of those up with either end of the fence, and I'm ready to go. I never burn an inch when I'm measuring. I always hook my tape measure on something. Now I'll cut the left-hand miter on the right-hand miter on this end. So I swing the saw to the right, I line the fixture up on my left. To measure from the short point of this piece, I flush the short point of the molding with the end of the fixture. If the piece is really long, I clamp it in place so it won't move. That's another reason I always carry a clamp in my bags. I think I'll make a 3/4 inch mark on this end too, right now. Now all I have to do is cut the cap for this end. Since I've got that mark at 3/4 of an inch, I don't even have to pull out a tape measure. Thinking ahead makes finish work a lot easier. You probably noticed that I used a different gun to fasten the cove molding to the apron. This is a 23 gauge micropinner, a really handy tool to have when working with moldings. It shoots an extremely small nail, a pin. It's so small and headless it even has an arrow on it to tell you which way to load it in the gun. You know, we used to call these 18 gauge guns pin nailers, and they seemed like pins compared to those standard 15 gauge nails. But when the 23 gauge guns came out, we had to change our tune. The combination of an 18 gauge nailer, one that shoots from 5/8 to 2 1/8 inch brads, and a 23 gauge micropinner, it's tough to beat. Whoops. Before nailing the apron to the wall, be sure to install the casing first so you can nail up through the bottom of the stool into the casing before putting the apron on. So I'll measure and install the casing right now. Cutting casing, as I've already shown you, is pretty straightforward. You just measure from the reveal lines. But this casing's a little bit of a different story. It's built up from 3 pieces. It has a 1x2 backband, an OG molding, and a 3.5-inch flat casing with a quirk and bead right on the edge. When you're working with material this wide, it can be tough to get the miter perfectly flush. Especially in here, right near the short point. You can get the long point and tack it with a nail, but the short point you can rarely get. I've always used a spline joint for that job, just like this one. The spline fits right inside the kerf and registers the 2 pieces together perfectly flush. A good biscuit will do the same thing. At least I discovered that recently when I got a new biscuit machine, but I'll show you that in a minute. With my old biscuit machine, there was a little wiggle room all the time, right between the kerf and the biscuits, so the 2 pieces never fit perfectly flush together. If you have that problem, or if you don't have a biscuit machine, you can use a router to make this joint. I'll show you how. Cut the kerf with a slot cutter mounted in a router. A good slot cutter will have at least 3 carbide teeth. This one's got 4. And this is a 1/4-inch cutter, so it has 1/4-inch teeth, and I use 1/4-inch material for the splines. MDF is the best thing to use because it's perfect. It's exactly 1/4 of an inch. The material just fits in the kerf, just perfectly. Before you use this tool, always clamp your material to a stable work surface, just like I was doing. And hold the router firmly, but don't press it down hard. If you press it down too hard, the router will rock, ruining the joint. Just relax and make the cuts slowly. Keep your eye on the short point too, right here, because you don't want the kerf to daylight out that end. That's exposed. But go ahead and run the kerf straight out the outside of the casing, because the backband will cover that later. I pre-cut all the casing earlier to save video time, but I used the same methods I showed you before. Now I'm just going to center this casing right on the window here. Sometimes older windows, or windows in older homes, aren't square along the jambs, so you have to check these miters before pre-assembling all the pieces. But this one I set, so I know it's square. I'm going to tack the casing to the jamb and to the wall. But instead of switching guns, I just want to demonstrate how this is done. So this material will stay up here long enough for us to finish this video. I'm going to put the backband on now, and I'll tack it to the head. And then the 2 legs. You should put glue into these joints too, into all your miters. I'm not doing it here because I'll be taking this apart as soon as we're through with this video. But you can nail all of these miters together once you've glued them up. That's the backband. Like I said, this is a 3-piece casing. The third piece is the OG molding that goes inside the back band. That was the head. Here's the 2 legs. Now is when I'd take a bigger gun, my 15 gauge nail gun, and shoot through the bottom of the stool right up into the casing. I'll just tack that with this gun. This is best done with a 15 gauge nailer, and then put the apron on right underneath and center that up. And if you do it right, it should line up perfectly flush. The edge of the apron should be perfectly plumb with the casing. I'm going to push this up and just tack it to the wall there. And that's about all there is to that casing. You know, some of you might be thinking, hey, why not attach the back band and the OG molding to the casing first and then cut the miters? You can do that. But with the back band installed, it's a little bit more difficult to cut the kerfs for the spline joints. Plus, if you nail the back band to the casing first, you can't adjust it tight against the wall. And that's what it's really meant for, to remove any irregularities or bows or bellies in the wall. Now, don't go thinking that this window takes 3 times as long to case just because there's 3 pieces of casing. 2 of them, the back band and the OG molding, are really the same measurement. The short point of the back band is the long point of the OG molding, so you can cut both pieces at your saw at the same time. Now I want to talk about installing wide casing. A biscuit joiner is great for wide casing like this, whether you're joining a miter or a plinth block or an overdoor head, like that one over there. Always invest in a good one though. Don't buy a cheap one like I did. And always clamp the material to a stable work surface and make a layout mark halfway across the miter. That way you can line up the biscuits perfectly. I hold the machine here and here so I can feel that it's resting flat on the workpiece. This is a pretty safe tool. The blade's surrounded by the housing, and it doesn't come out until you plunge it. But I still keep my fingers pretty far from the cut. There's a registration mark right inside the face of the tool here on the plate joiner. You line that up with the mark you made on the miter, and then just plunge the plate joiner right into the miter. I keep my hand on the back, like I said, to make sure that the plate joiner stays flat on the back of the casing. To close this miter, I use a special set of clamps. Let me put a biscuit in here. I'm not going to put any glue into this one, but normally you'd glue inside this kerf first. Even if you don't use a spline or a biscuit, Jim Chestnut's clam clamps work great, especially for assembling casing like this. They've got little teeth in here that grab the back of the casing. The clamps grab aggressively. And they leave small marks at the back edge of the casing. But a little spackle here on the back of this casing is a lot better than having an open miter down here. The subject of casing is endless. There isn't room in this program to cover every casing problem or design possibility, but I do want to talk about classical door heads because they look great. They're fun to build, and knowing how to create designs like this will help you land better jobs. First, notice that the end of the frieze board isn't flush with the casing. That's because this entire head is meant to mimic an entablature from a classical order. Remember, an order is nothing more than a couple of posts with a beam on top, like a header. And we all know how terrible it looks when someone cuts a beam flush with the posts. A cantilever or an extension always looks better. And the same holds true for this door head. I've added a 1/2 inch to the bead molding here so it cantilevers past the casing, and I've added a 1/4 inch to the length of the frieze on both sides. And now let's look closely at the crown or the cap. The extension here measures a 1/4 inch too, but pay close attention to this. That measurement's taken from right here, where the fillet on the cap ends. The measurement's not taken from the actual long point of the casing up here. Why don't we cut those pieces, and I'll assemble them, and I'll show you what I mean.
First, I cut the frieze, starting with the self-return cap. Next, I cut the miter on the right end. Then I mark the measurement, hooking my tape on the long point. That's the easy part. But before cutting that miter, I cut the self-return cap off the end so I don't have to work with a piece of material that's too short to hold safely. I like to make that square cut first just to make sure the piece is perfectly square before I cut that cap. And I swing the saw back and cut to the measurement mark for that miter. I cut the bead molding now, but for the bead molding, I use a zero clearance fixture, making a square cut first. And once again, I'm going to cut that self-return cap first. So I swing the saw and slide my fixture until it's flush with that end so the blade falls in that curve. There's my self-return cap. I could just flip that piece of material right now to cut the miter, but I'm going to swing that saw anyway. Now this is a long point measurement again, so I hook my tape on the long point and measure out 34¼ inches. I swing my saw in the opposite direction, flush the zero clearance fixture up with the fence on my saw, and creep right up to that miter, cutting right through the graphite line. Once again, I could have just flipped the material in my saw because it's perfectly symmetrical. You can do that. But I didn't want anyone to think I was cheating. There's the last cap. Now all that's left is the cap or the crown for the top. And I don't need a zero clearance fixture box for that.
You noticed I followed the same techniques I've already demonstrated, using that zero clearance fixture for the bead molding so the material won't be drawn into the blade, cutting the self-return cap first, and creeping the material and a measurement mark right up to the blade. For the crown molding though, I don't need that fixture because the material is so big even a small piece won't be drawn up into the blade. But as I pointed out when I was measuring the door, I can't measure the crown from the long point of the miter. If I do, the piece will be much too short. I call this the false long point. I have to measure from right here, where the reveal begins. That's what I call the real long point. You run into the same situation with rabbeted panel molding, where the real long point ends up underneath the material. With this molding, though, it's easy to measure from the real long point. I just hook my tape measure right there on the fillet, at the long point of the fillet, and all I have to do is line up the blade with this measurement mark that I'm going to make. 34¼ inches. This piece is going to be a little short too, so once again, I'll cut that self-return cap first. And now I'll swing the saw and just make sure that the blade passes right through my measurement mark. And that's it. Now I can assemble all these pieces at the work table. I showed you this glue earlier while I was assembling the stool. I liked the 2P10 glue a lot. It's great for quickly joining self-returns, especially for the stool, and for moldings without profiles, like this bead and frieze here. You know, it's really important to keep up with new developments in our industry, tools, materials, and sometimes the specialized techniques associated with them. Like this crown here. I'm not going to use the 2P10 on that. With new building materials constantly entering the market, the days of just driving your pickup to the job with your bags, a circular saw, and a 100-foot extension cord, they're over. If you want to make a good living at carpentry, and that means make a decent profit and enjoy yourself while you're doing it, you have to keep up with the latest trends in carpentry. Believe me, if you do, you'll be a cut above other carpenters. You know, I've learned more in the last few years while attending and doing presentations at shows like JLC Live than I learned in the previous 25 years. And I learned a lot from magazines like Fine Home Building and JLC. And from really good books like this one. And I also learn a lot from websites too. And these spring clamps, they're just one example. I learned about them at my first JLC Live show. If the molding has a lot of profile to it, like this door cap, or if I'm assembling crown molding, I prefer to use Titebond 3 or Titebond 2. Titebond 3, that's Franklin's latest addition to the adhesives arsenal. And with these clamps, I can glue up the miters, then stick the clamps on. And you can see that usually the glue out just squeezes out of there just perfectly. And it'll stay that way too, even when I shoot a nail right through the miter. You know, if I tried doing that without the clamps on there, the nail would go through the first piece, then hit the second piece, and spread the miter apart. Either that, or I'd have to put the death grip on these two little pieces, you know, with that glue in between there, and then I'd risk shooting a nail into my finger, because when you put the death grip on with that glue in there, it acts like a little lubricant, and just as you're about to fire the nail, the piece slides apart, and you either shoot your finger or you fire a nail through the miter when it's not even tight together. As I said before, anytime you catch yourself using the death grip, stop what you're doing. You can't do good work when you're using your hands as clamps. and you're probably 1 or 2 seconds from hurting yourself. The bead molding is easy to install. First, I'm going to run a line of glue right across the top of this frieze. Then I'll center the molding. Now this is the back, and I'm standing on the face of it. I'm just going to center the molding just like so, and get it flush to the back of the frieze. There. The bead molding's easy, but the cap's another story. The cap sits on top of the frieze. Looks just like this. I could clamp this piece with my hand and fire a nail through here, but that's a lot of wood for a nail to pass through, and anything can happen along the way. Instead, I'll clamp the cap to the frieze just like this, right to my workbench. First I'll center it. Then I'll grab one of these quick grip clamps. There, that'll do it. Now I can take a nail gun. Oh no, I'm not going to shoot a nail through there. Maybe you've got the nerve, but I don't. If the nail follows a twist in the grain here, it could pop right out through the face of the frieze. No matter how good a job I did at spackling, sometime down the road that blemish would telegraph right through the paint. You know it would. To be on the safe side, I take an extra minute or two and drill a pilot hole all the way through the cap with a bit that's just a little bit bigger than a drywall screw. Then I secure the cap to the frieze without fear.
When I say a pilot hole, I mean a through hole, large enough to clear the screw threads so the screw doesn't grab in the cap at all. And trim head screws work perfectly for this application. They weren't available 20 years ago when I made this DVD. And it sure doesn't hurt to put some glue between the frieze and the cap.
Now, doesn't that look good? So far, I've covered the easy part about casing, when it fits on the wall. But what do you do when the casing doesn't fit and you have to scribe it? One of the most common problems carpenters face in the field, especially when we're installing wide casing like this, is not having enough room on the wall for the casing, and then you have to scribe it to fit. I used to reach for a tape measure right off the bat and measure how much to rip off the outside edge of the casing at the top, at the middle, and at the bottom. And I'd cross my fingers every time, hoping it measured the same from the top to the bottom, or at least close enough to fudge, so I could run it through a table saw, but that rarely happened. So I'd have to cut a little and check the fit, then cut a little more, you know what I mean. Hey, listen, next time you bump into one of these pieces, don't be tempted to measure it. That's a red herring. Instead, reach for your brad nailer. In this case, it's the plinth on this column that sticks out the farthest. So I'll just tack the molding there, right up against the plinth. If you're just working with a drywall corner, don't nail it tight into the corner. Always leave the molding away from the corner, just in case the top is closer. Even though most of the time it's the bottom that's closer to the jamb because the drywallers build up the mud down there thinking the baseboard will cover it. Now I pull out my tape measure to see how far the casing's sticking out past the jamb. Then I reach up to the top and hold the casing so it's the same distance from the jamb. And I tack it there too. The point is to make the casing parallel to the jamb. That's the same thing we were doing with the window stool earlier, making it parallel to the window sash before scribing the horns. That's what scribing's all about, parallel surfaces. You can check that it's parallel with a tape measure if you want to read the numbers, or you can do it with your scribes. Just make sure that the casing is perfectly parallel to the jamb at the middle, the top, and the bottom. Once you're sure it's parallel, spread your scribes another 1/4 of an inch. That's for the reveal. You can measure that or just use your eye. Then scribe a line down the back of the casing, being careful to keep your scribes level, perpendicular to the wall, like so. If your scribes tip or tilt, the scribe line won't be parallel. See? And you'll be wasting your time. But that doesn't mean you have to concentrate really hard on keeping your scribes perpendicular to the wall. See, they can angle up to almost 5 degrees before you get off the scribe line. To make this cut, you can use a circular saw, a jigsaw, or you can use a table saw and rip the piece close to the line, then use a power plane to get right up to the scribe line. I'm going to demonstrate each one of those techniques. And let's start with a table saw. When I use a table saw to make this rip, I always tip the saw blade to a 15 or 20 degree angle first to make a back cut. Back cutting close to the scribe line makes it easier to fit the piece tight to the wall. Any bumps or small imperfections in the corner won't interfere with the edge of the molding touching the drywall. Plus, if you angle the rough cut, it's a lot easier to plane right to the scribe line. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. Oh, this area down here, right around the plinth, I'll cut that later. You can see I'm not going right to the scribe line. I'm staying about 1/8 of an inch away at the closest point. Once you've made the rough cut, you can trim to the scribe line using a sharp hand plane, a belt sander, or an electric plane. I'll finish this cut with a circular saw so I can show you that method too. With the casing clamped to the table, it's a lot easier to hold this saw and follow the scribe line. Remember, always have 2 hands on your power tools if you want to cut accurately and safely. Let me put a clamp on this other end too. I'm going to stay a little away from the scribe line, pretty much the same thing I did with the table saw, and just remove the majority of the waste. Notice I'm back cutting with a circular saw too. Back cutting makes it even easier to follow the scribe line because I can guide the saw by lifting it or lowering it slightly. Try it, you'll see what I mean immediately. Oh, you know, I think I'll finish this with a jigsaw, and I'll cut this notch down here for the plinth area too. I've removed the base that came with this saw and replaced it with a Collins coping foot. This foot is miraculous. It's not only great for coping crown molding and baseboard, but it allows you to cut anything from the back side. And for a scribe like this, where you want a back cut right to the line, this foot is ideal. First, I'm going to take this scribe line right here and continue it across the top of the shoulder for the plinth notch. And then I'll take the jigsaw. I'll cut that little shoulder. Now I'll trim the rest of the cut to the scribe line using this plane. I like to set the plane to cut just under a 1/16 of an inch deep. That way I can creep up on the scribe line but still make pretty good progress. I make several passes. Sometimes I'm lifting the back of the plane a little to control the depth of cut, and I'm also controlling the depth of cut by changing the angle of the back cut, just like I did with the circular saw. Lifting or lowering the angle of the plane just a little helps me cut right to the scribe line. There. Let's go see how it fits. There. That's not bad at all.